Well, Law 470, I'm really very excited to introduce Semaj Brown to you. I know you've had a chance to read her paper, and I thought I'd give you a bit of a background. I met Mrs. Brown probably 8 years ago or so. She and her husband, Dr. James Brown, were very active in the Flint area, working with community groups, working with children, focusing on nutrition, creative writing, science. She's very much a Renaissance woman. And I had the privilege of doing some trademark work for one of her books and her CDs involved with vegetarian cooking and health. And a few years ago, we became Facebook friends also. So I've had a chance to watch her comments on various matters. And over the summer, she was talking about the rebranding by Aunt Jemima and Eskimo and much of what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. So I asked her a couple of months ago whether I would be allowed to use her written paper for my class and whether she would be willing to come and talk about the evolution of her own thinking. One of the things I was struck by in the written paper was that she began by saying that part of the inspiration for the paper came from reading what a friend of hers said, raising the question about whether the images that appear on these products, whether they are indeed stereotypes. And I was pleased to see that even people who are her friends can be in a position where they need to think more deeply about some of these issues, and she was willing to begin that discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Brown, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. I'm going to begin with the words of the great Dr. Maya Angelou. The plague of racism is insidious, entering into our minds as smoothly and quietly and invisibly as floating airborne microbes enter into our bodies to find life long purchased in our bloodstreams. And with that, I extend deep appreciation and gratitude to Professor Susan Kornfield for inviting me to guest lecture, impart my work to you, an esteemed group of senior law students, next generation of very fine attorneys, counselors who will have a quintessential role in shaping our society. Thank you all, and thank you, Professor Susan Kornfield. I offer the essay branded, The Buying, Frying, Making, Baking of African American Domestic Stereotypes. But are they really stereotypes? That was the question that propelled this essay. I was strolling, just as Susan said, I was strolling Facebook when I encountered a post regarding the removal of the facial emblems of Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben. And then there was this question that said, but are they really stereotypes? And I said, of course they're stereotypes. And then I said, well, who's posing such a question? And then I found out it was my friend, my 20-year-plus friend, who's an anthropology professor, Dr. Sananda Samadar-Corrado. We have done many projects together. And so I started pecking, my rebuttal and explanation as to why they're really stereotypes. And then I said, oh, this is too hard. And I don't want to have this conversation with Sananda in public. I can call her this evening. And then very carefully, I removed those comments. And I said, I'll take her out of it because I don't want this to be a battle between me and Sananda. I don't want the community to see that. And so I put them on my timeline. And I was very surprised because all of a sudden people started sharing the comments and they started sharing, these were notes at this point, sharing the notes, and they went into different groups and they started talking about them, talking about these notes and messaging me and asking me my opinion. Meanwhile, just as Susan said, she was scrolling too and she saw the notes and she asked me could she use them? Could she utilize them for your class? I said, most certainly. But then I thought a little deeply about it. And I thought, well, these are the attorneys. Very shortly, I said, they deserve more than my notes. So I need to turn this into a paper for them. So I went to Sananda and I said, Sananda, this is what this is the paper, but I took your name off. And she said, oh, no, put my name back on. I said, well, are you sure you want your name on there? She said, yes, because it gives empirical validity, spoken like a true professor. And she said, that's what education is all about. You're supposed to have the freedom to ask the questions without fear of retaliation for asking the question. And that's what I was trying to protect her from the community. And so she said, oh no, go right ahead. And so I did, and the paper was written, and I am here. And so if Dr. Sananda wondered if they were truly stereotypes, I wondered how many other people are thinking in that vein or not thinking at all about it. Just accepting those images as part of the American landscape. Just in the background, not thinking about it. And I said, let me see. And so for a moment, I would like to spend some time on the first word of the title, branded. Now, I first heard that word when I was a little girl because we had lots of Westerns in those days. Cowboys, Manifest Destiny. I think Hollywood was still creating mythology about how the West was won and the savage Indians and the virtuous cowboys. And they had this cattle that they would be driving from one place to the other. But in order to keep the cattle and keep control over their product, because that's what their product was, the cattle, they had to brand the cattle. And they did this branding with what you call a branding rod. And it's long steel, well, then iron rod. And at the end of the rod, there usually were the initials of the owners of this cattle. And they would put it into a very hot fire. So for branding, the fire has to be very hot, somewhere between 350 and 800 degrees, depends on what you're branding. So if you're branding cattle, there are some rules. If you put the brand on the cattle and then you turn it a little bit and you apply pressure, if you take it off too quickly, because the cattle is going to respond, because this is response to a stimulus and the cattle is alive. And that's part of one of the basic characteristics of something being alive, an organism being alive. You respond to the stimulus, so the cattle screams. And if you take it off too soon, then the body is amazing. It repairs itself and the brand leaves and the fur grows over. If you leave it on too long, the subcutaneous tissue will be damaged and infection could set in, and then you could lose your product. And the whole point of branding is to have a product that you make money off from, in this case at least. And so we know other things can be branded, like wood. So if you have soft wood, your time that you're going to leave that marker on there is going to be less than if you have hardwood. The temperature is going to fluctuate depending on what you're branding. So if you brand skin, as they did with African Americans when they were captured during the enslavement era, so they would brand the skin of the African Americans because they were absolutely property. And so that brand stayed on for the life of the human being. And so we have these materials. We have wood, we have cattle, we have human skin. But what if you're branding the mind? You're trying to brand the societal mind. How long will it take? Now for the cattle, the brand stays on, you apply that intense pressure for only 2 to 3 seconds, depending on the thickness of the hide of the steer. But if you're talking about branding the mind, are we talking about 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? A century? Well, you know, it's been over a century since that very first human emblem of Aunt Jemima was branded. And she was a captured African. She was an enslaved human being. And they took that image and they branded it, and it's been branded, that was since 1889. And the Emancipation Proclamation was 1863. So it was only about 26 years after the official end of slavery, but we know enslavement policies persisted. And so the question begs, are they really stereotypes? And I write, Uncle Ben and Aunt Jemima are more than stereotypes. They are the forced, institutionalized manifestation of deferred dreams, as are all the happy Negro domesticated mascots of multinational corporations that promote the fictionalized idea of a gentle South, decorated with cheerful Negro servants. The South was as gentle as the killing of George Floyd. Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, and the cream of wheat man all wear the stylized expressions of capture. Their images are forever trapped in American history, imprinting the continuum of the unshakable, barely bearable faces of exploitation, the violent American history. And people will ask me, Semaj, Mrs. Brown, how do these smiling faces suggest a violent American history? And in turn, I will ask them 3 questions. What is the history? What is the origin? And what is the context? Please, for a moment, become illustrators with me. Our minds not only draw conclusions, but they can draw pictures as well. So, if you would, in your mind, draw a huge circle. Thank you. And then draw a circle inside the circle. And then a circle inside that circle. And all these concentric rings, and keep doing it, please, until there's no more room to draw a circle. And in that space where there's no more room, place a dot. That dot is you. That dot is me. It's actually my pupil, your pupil. It's what I see. It's what you see. It is the context, your personal context. And if you want the answer to the question, how do these smiling faces suggest a violent American history? You have to open your lens. You have to have a larger context. You are actually drawing a lens, a view. It has to be beyond your own personal lens, your view. It has to be historical. It has to be contextual. And the smiling faces, the cruelty, the violence, that's in the smile. There it is in the smile. Because the smile is a thin veil of protection from the daily savagery that Black people endured during the enslavement era. And remember, Aunt Jemima was already an enslaved person. So to have her smiling like she's happy and the South is wonderful, many Black people smiled. Maybe some of you have heard this. Yes, 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 ma'am. I's a happy. That was the language and posturing that was necessary to assuage the deranged minds of their oppressors. They had to smile as they plotted and they planned and they revolted and they read and they prayed and they escaped. They had to smile. This is well documented. This language is a language of resistance. It's a language of cover. It's a language that is exemplified in the Paul Laurence poem, We Wear the Mask. Paul Laurence, a very famous African American poet. We wear the mask. I'll read 4 lines. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts, we smile. And now the dolled up first 21st century Aunt Jemima, the one they made more contemporary. It's merely an updated, sanitized attempt at erasing the brutal economic system structure from which these images hail. They hail from a monetary system that subsequently profited the descendants and multinational corporations for centuries while erecting impenetrable structures to the advancement of Black economic development. So we're talking about over a century. So the smiling faces are not happy smiling faces. The smiling faces on commercial packaging from that time are the same forced smiling faces of fear and oppression from the enslavement era and the de facto enslavement era and the Jim Crow era. And so that's how the plastered smiling faces are oppressed smiling faces. And Langston Hughes, I talked about Deferred Dream, another wonderful poet, talked about dreams deferred and what happens to them. Well, in this case, they got poured into syrup bottles and they were packaged into boxes of rice and pancake mix. And they spilled all over the highways and the byways. And the pancake mix became a powder cake and they blew up. And that's what's happening in our society now. We see a blowing up of these deferred dreams. And I ask, why do food companies boast pictures of branded 18th century Black domestic workers? Why don't they have pictures of their food? What is the pairing about Black domestic workers and the food? Is it just a marketing strategy? Nothing's just a anything. Everything has a root. Everything has an origin. It's marketing to possibly a segment of white Americans that yearn for nostalgia of the good old days, of the good old days of the 40s, of the 50s, this idealized time that never was good, but it's a fiction, it's a narrative. You see it in Gone with the Wind. What has happened by ingesting this food and digesting the meal? There's an emotional cannibalism. consisting of pancakes, as well as the made-to-order petrified, smiling in time Black servants. These consumers are consumers of we're talking about total consummation of a people, consumed for well over a century. Racism du jour on a serving platter is the menu advertisers sell. 365 days of the year promoting Black people as product, or promoting Black people as a fantasy of servitude to enhance the product. It's better when Black people are serving. Why? Because it reinforces an invisible caste system. Much of this is subconscious with the public. That's what advertisers do. They are master dehumanizationers. This is transference. This is not new. It didn't start with the pancakes. This is a continuation. These faces are the same faces during chattel slavery. This is a continuation of the system body of racism. It's consistent with the moral tenets of the initiation of corporate capitalism. This is when corporate capitalism began, during chattel slavery. That's the beginning of corporate capitalism. And corporations have been mercenary in upholding Blacks as permanent American subclass by manufacturing images which reinforce a culturally embedded lie of Black inferiority. Marketers don't only assault Black people, they assault all people, the imagination of the society, by fabricating a visual narrative that asserts through branding and mass staining of billions of dollars in industry over time. And when we were just talking about branding, how long, the duration? So in this case, we're talking about 130 something years, a century or more, going on 150 years. The pressure, billions of dollars, mass marketing. So the so-named Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben images are seared into the captured consciousness of the American public. This stereotyping, product making machine is immensely effective in corralling ideas and thus opportunities related to African American advancement. Now, I assert that they could have done this. They could have made pancakes and Uncle Ben rice and all of these things without denigrating a people. Black people who gave so much in labor, free labor, and in blood, and then have to be subjected to the plastering and the psychological damage of the plastering of these emblems. And I understand in some enclaves in white America, there are no Black people at all, no people of color. And I understand that sometimes Aunt Jemima was the only African American person that white people saw on their breakfast tables. So this is pre-language, because I can imagine a toddler sitting there in the high chair and looking at this emblem, this fictitious emblem, and thinking that's an African American woman. That's what they are. They belong on boxes. They're objects. They're things. And once the branding has occurred, and it did occur, and it was successful, it happened. And now the corporations do a noble favor to us all. And they say, oh, wait, these images might be discriminatory. Oh, we didn't know that. We're going to take them down. We're going to take them down right away, straight away. And so I say there's a problem with that, because after almost 150 years of branding, the name Aunt Jemima is completely seared into our consciousness. And if you close your eyes and I whisper her name, Aunt Jemima, you will see her. I will see her. It's part of the American landscape. Blacks as domesticated purchased products. It's like that stop sign I talked about in the paper. It doesn't have to spell the words. All we need is the shape and red, and we know to stop. That's the way the human brain works. It's easy to brainwash. It's easy to condition. And so, such is the delicious, insidious example of the hidden mechanisms embedded in institutionalized racism. That's why it's institutionalized, because it's hidden. You have to know how to parse it out. You have to know what you're looking for. You have to have a lens that's bigger than your own perspective. You have to have a topographical view as well. And then you have to surgically dissect it and open it up to see what's going on. So the damage, the socio-psychological scar tissue forms in a distorted mind malignancy that will persist as long as the names persist for generations into the future. So they're taking the faces down. Do you think they're going to change the name? I would be surprised if they did. They don't need to. I ask, where are the corrective measures for the reconstruction? Where's the social surgery to mitigate the damage from these cultural corporate disfigurement campaigns? Recently, I saw Good Morning America. It's called 3. It comes on in the afternoon. And they were doing a feature on the descendants of the original Aunt Jemima, which that was not her name. But the descendants this year had saved up enough money to buy her a headstone. This year. So I ask, as Randall Robinson has asked, what is the debt that is owed? What is the debt that is owed? And Land O'Lakes butter. What was that First Nations woman doing on Land O'Lakes butter? This indigenous human being, why was she barely clothed on the butter? What were they selling? During Manifest Destiny, with the cattle that I talked about, they were going through, the Indians were thought of as savages. They were people to be annihilated. They were people to be murdered and killed, and the land was to be taken and stolen. How did this flip? All of a sudden, well, she's good for selling butter. She's fit to sell butter. This is a question that we should all ponder. What happened in the culture? What happened in the society where there was this huge swing and they could put this image on butter, barely clothed, and say, buy our butter. It's better because she's on it. What were they branding? What does it say about that first world indigenous woman? What were they trying to say? And we all know that we love food. I love food. Yes, I was putting my wedding ring on, getting ready for this, and it was a little tight because we've been in pandemic. And I said, oh, that's a sign, you know? I said, I got to get with my program. Food, it's so necessary. It's primal. We need it. We celebrate it. It's your auntie's specialty. It's her dish that she brings a holiday. It's what you've been working with. It's what your father might barbecue or your sister might barbecue. If you're a vegetarian like me, it's like, you just think of everything you can do with vegetables. And food is so important. It marks our lives for graduations, for weddings, and the sorrowful times too, for repasts and for funerals. Food, we are so connected. It is so necessary. So for advertisers it is brilliantly immoral. The marketing of dehumanization, in the marketing of Black people into objects and to bind food, and our subjugation, or African American subjugation, or anybody's subjugation to food. It's quite brilliant in dehumanization, and it's systematic. And so after a while, these boxes and bottles in the supermarket, they didn't have supermarkets then because we had to span a long period of time. Now we have supermarkets. As we stroll down the supermarkets, we don't see the faces anymore. They're just a blur. And so these images become more and more objectified. And as we use the containers and we pour out the pancake mix of Aunt Jemima, we make the pancakes. And when we're finished, what do? We toss them. They're disposable. They're consumable. We toss them. And we have been tossing them and tossing Black people for how many years? If the illustrators of these exploited renderings allowed the characters to speak, what would those contrived caricatures say? I ask this question because it's important, because Aunt Jemima is a fiction. And if they can write fiction, I can too. I have the right. And I know the representative of Aunt Jemima came from a place. She wasn't born on a box. She had a history behind her. She had a family behind her. She crossed a huge ocean. She was able to survive chattel slavery and the cruelty of it. And so to give her voice, what would she say? Oh, I'm sure she would say, take me off this rectangular nightmare. Pay me my royalties. I am not your servant into perpetuity. I am not your aunt. What would they say? She would go on and say, I wanted to be a concert pianist. I studied and graduated from the Detroit Conservatory of Music, but due to your racist appetite, I am stuck here on a cereal box, far away from my capacity. And what would he say, Uncle Ben? He would say, I'm from Cameroon. My people invented iron smelting. I did the work all through the French Quarter. But instead of smelting iron, instead of using my blacksmith skills, I am stirring rice. I am stuck on this box as a box butler. And he would tell you, I am not your uncle. And how they would both ask, did you derive this relationship to be familial? Is it so the corporations feel less guilty? Is it just a complete erasure and rewriting of history? How could they be the aunt and uncle? Because we rename you like you're a steer or an animal, and we'll call you what we want to call you. We will take your names away from you. And instead of being a familial relationship, it is a relationship of exploitation. And as the inanimate fling themselves into animation, into freedom, and leap from cereal and pancake boxes, shout from neon-colored cardboard that rattles rice off the shelves in red-lined ghettos, as the labels unstick, burning off the ghastly glue of subjugation, as the structure of mammy-shaped glass and plastic syrup bottles transform, melt into Phoenix, Queen, Nzinga, spirit power, and red, green, and black pellet flames beat like hearts and drums to the pulse of political, economic, and social uprisings as justice obliterates all the containers of injustice, giving life to the montage of dreams deferred, so defined by Mr. Hughes, the human possibilities incarcerated in boxed systems of white supremacy explode. If the commercial, unethically branded, were asked to speak, what would they say? What would you say? What would you say? What will you say? Thank you. What will you say? I'll leave it with you. What will you say? Counselors to be, what will you say? Thank you very much.
Well, I should begin by saying, about 3 years ago, I heard Mrs. Brown do mostly a one-woman show at the Wright Museum in Detroit, Bleeding Fire. She was then joined with children who were dancing. There was a multimedia presentation behind her. There was live drumming. There was poetry, chanting. There was song. And I do not remember taking a breath for about 2 hours. It was astonishing.
Thank you very much.
It was astonishing. And once we're through this virus, since I know you had more than one event that had to be rescheduled, I look forward to that again.
Thank you.
I think it is difficult for us to know immediately what to say, which is why I want to ask you either comments, thoughts. One thought I had when Mrs. Brown said, "We will take your names away," I just immediately thought of Lady Antebellum and the dispute with Lady A, right? Lady Antebellum, Lady A who goes back 20 years, and Lady Antebellum whose trademark registration goes back 10. But I also wanted to ask, and we can either do it now, if you have particular questions, I would love for you to ask them now. I also sent Mrs. Brown the series of slides that I posted to Canvas about this topic, because she and I talked about certain of those slides, and I thought the discussion was absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to first ask, let me just check my watch, first ask if you have particular questions right this second that you'd like to ask. Mrs. Brown is going to stay here. We're going to have a chance to ask her in a few minutes.
I'd like to say something. I want to be sure, because this is being recorded, that I give a sincere hello to the Flint community, as I am the Flint's first poet laureate. And so wherever I am speaking, I always talk about just to say hello to Flint and tell them I love them, and I'm planning, and I hope I represented you well. And here we are, Flint. I am your poet, and I am here in this wonderful setting with these future attorneys, and I am representing you, Flint. So I wanted to get that in. Thank you.